Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to have fun. We're going to bring together some people who probably would never meet in real life. I'm going to have a conversation about something that I'm planning for them, but I don't know whether they would ever hit upon if they did meet in real life. I want to talk about kelp and ice in Hudson Bay. Well, you have to explain yourself if you're going to talk about that. So I have an expert on kelp who's going to be talking, answering any questions I might have, and I have a lot of them, about kelp in Arctic waters. And this is Brian von Herzen, who's the founder and executive director of the Climate Foundation. He's engaged in permaculture of the ocean, especially in creating large kelp farms in the Pacific. And so we can refer to him as the authority on kelp. But I'm very interested in kelp and ice in Hudson Bay. And for that, we need to talk to somebody who knows a thing or two about Hudson Bay. And that is Lawrence Martin. He is a Canadian musician and singer, a songwriter, and a politician of Cree heritage. He's also a Juno winner, believe it or not, for singing in Cree, I believe. He's active in Indigenous politics and a former mayor of Cochrane, Ontario. He's now the manager of a feasibility study regarding marine conservation of Hudson Bay and James Bay, which is it's big, but compared to the size of Hudson Bay, it's a little extra bay. And so we're going to have the benefit of his knowledge of especially that region. Now, I'm also glad to see that Peter Wadhams has just joined us, because Peter Wadhams is the ice expert for Northern Arctic ice. Closer to home is my assistant, Adam Wynn, who's in the other room. He's somebody I depend on every day, and he has a strong interest in Northern affairs, Canadian affairs. And my friend Ellen Judd, who is in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She is a retired professor of anthropology, University of Manitoba. Peter Wadhams is part of a plan which we've been thinking about, which is a very innovative and uncertain at this point. We're very far from convinced that we'll be able to do it. But one of the things that we want to investigate is the possibility of refreezing some of the ice in the Arctic by spraying seawater into the air, where it will go up to lower clouds and brighten the clouds, turn them more white in the summertime, and reflect more sun back into space, and thereby cool the water that's underneath. And this could, the next time it's time to freeze, it would make it easier for it to freeze and stay frozen, because the water will be cooler than it would have otherwise been. So we are very, very far from saying that this is going to happen. We have not, it's just a very brilliant idea, but we can imagine all kinds of things that get in the way. But in the course of thinking about that, I also began to think about the people who live on the shores of Hudson Bay, mostly Indigenous communities. They're Cree, they're Inuit, there are probably other Dene, I think, communities that make their living from having an opportunity to go on the ice and hunt and fish and so on. And so it's very important to talk to people who live there before going too far with our far out ideas. And so we need a lot of conversations about the very idea, whether people would want to have, parts of the Hudson Bay refrozen and kept frozen year round, if it could be done, which maybe it can and maybe it can't. In thinking about that, I became aware that, there are a lot of other people who also depend on Hudson Bay for their livelihood, but they if there's no ice on it, is there anything else that they can do to make a good living and create jobs there? And one of the things that I understand is happening in the Arctic waters now is that kelp or seaweed is proliferating. I was amazed to know that seaweed could grow in Arctic waters, but it's not only growing, but it's really going gangbusters, really flourishing. And so it occurs to me that maybe there's a possibility of creating a situation where the local people harvest some of the kelp and manufacture some of the things that would be helpful for farmers to use for fertilizer and for stimulating the growth of their plants, which also would be helpful for our main purpose, which is combating global warming and bringing the climate crisis back under control, because kelp are very good at capturing carbon out of the atmosphere. So that was the idea that I wanted to explore. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to think about what might go wrong with such a plan, which I have to say is very unlikely to happen. It's probably a goofy notion, but when I talked to Brian, he didn't laugh at me for this strange, far out idea that maybe we could create jobs for people manufacturing stuff from kelp. So I want to maybe ask Brian, if you will, Brian, give us a little rundown on what might be, why we would maybe want to have kelp production, not just to create jobs, but what other good things kelp might do for us, and anything bad, because we have to really pay attention to the potentially negative consequences of this weird idea of mine. So would you do that, Brian?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Meta. Thank you, and greetings, everyone. Yeah, kelp is pretty transformative. I think it's important to understand that in North America and in Australia alone, we've lost 3,000 square kilometers of kelp forest over the last century because the water's become too warm in traditional habitat and the nutrient levels have become too low. So there's a chance to try to regenerate that. Now, Hudson Bay may actually be some of the beneficiary of that, because in waters that may have been frozen or too cold previously, there are a lot of kelp species, macroalgae species, that are now coming into their preeminence. So regions that could not support kelp before, including limitations in Hudson's Bay and James Bay, are now possible. In fact, there are some recent papers on this that I can share with you, some images of the increase in area that's possible in a warmer world. Kelp has a lot of benefits. We can produce food, feed, and fertilizer products from it, and it's quite sustainable. It also creates a lot of fish habitat, as shown behind me right here. Forage fish love to hang out in kelp forests because it protects them from predators. And then the game fish, of course, love to come around and try to eat the forage fish, and it produces a biodiversity and an ecosystem. Kelp occurs naturally in bays like Hudson Bay, but the species are changing in a warmer world. And I have some charts that I can share with you on the different pictures of the different kinds of kelp, and also maps of Hudson Bay showing where the kelp's likely to increase and where it's likely to decrease. It's not a zero-sum game. And we need to monitor that. And, kelp is a naturally occurring ecosystem, so it will evolve. But I think there's a chance for economic as well as ecological opportunities, certainly in Hudson Bay and James Bay going forward.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you. Well, Lawrence Martin, you have now been informed about this strange proposal. Tell me how goofy it seems to you, and let's take it from there.
But every good idea always seems goofy at the beginning, right? And it takes a lot to try and prove otherwise. In regards to kelp and where I work in Hudson Bay and James Bay, we only began to do the studies the last couple of years, actually, with scientist partners to come in and actually determine the amount of kelp that is in the Hudson Bay and James Bay area, and to see all of the different information that Dr. Brian has mentioned and where it is exactly. So we've been able to locate some of that information, but our study is not just on kelp, but actually the whole biodiversity of Hudson Bay and James Bay. So we could take a look at what the production levels are at there for all activities that happen in these two bays, because for one thing, we have these billions of birds that come from South America and North America into the area every spring, and so they're there for a very specific reason, to feed and to breed and so on. So we know there is a lot of that going on. And with this talk about the climate change and the changes that have happened over the years, we do see changes happening in the migratory birds. There's new birds coming in as the weather starts to warm up. There's new species of birds coming in. And there's new species of fish that are coming down the rivers as well that are now inhabiting James Bay and Hudson Bay. And it's being noticed by the people who live along the shorelines, as you mentioned. And so as we find what's under the bay, what's under the water, even this summer we had the National Geographic people come and do some filming underwater in Hudson Bay and parts of James Bay. So the studies are only beginning to take place in regards to what is in the waters of James Bay and Hudson Bay. However, our people, our Inuit people and our First Nations Cree people, Muskego people, have always known what's there. And so we're doing a study also on traditional and ecological knowledge as part of our feasibility study for the National Marine Conservation Area designation that we're hoping to have. There's a number of things that we want to have that designation for. One is to be able to become partners with Canada and other non-government organizations like foundations and so forth that can help us, preserve the earth and try to keep it safe and keep it intact for all of us humans and other living species to continue. So there's an agreement between Canada and Muskego Council that I represent that's looking at a number of different types of studies. We'll be looking at eelgrass as well, because eelgrass has been the food source for the geese that come up from the south. But that eelgrass is disappearing, so we want to know why and what can we do to sustain this the food that we depend on every spring for our families. So we're looking at different things, and of course, as the ships go and do these research, they are finding this kelp, but it's mostly on the eastern side, on the Quebec side of our area, as opposed to our side, because our side is very shallow and it's very sandy, because we have a lot of these rivers that are just flowing out all these sediments into the James Bay and Hudson Bay, for one thing. And it's a different terrain. So there's a lot of questions still for us to determine, about the kelp itself. And but it's been known to be there from our people for many years. As a matter of fact, it's even part of our creation story.
Oh, really? The kelp thing. Yeah, I believe I've heard that the kelp grows in rocky places. If the shoreline is rocky underwater, is that the case? But you say it's sandy on the western side.
That's right. So therefore, the kelp is further out in the bay as opposed to close to the shoreline.
Oh.
And whereas on the Quebec side, it's very rocky on that side, so it's more closer to the shoreline on that area. And especially further north, as we merge James Bay into the Hudson Bay, that's where you'll find most of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you have to do this as farms? I know that Brian is setting up a very structured kind of place where he's farming kelp in the Pacific Ocean. But I presume that, people could, maybe they already know how, go out and just pick up the stuff or drag it to shore and produce commodities from it. There are various things that could be produced. What would have to be done are there places that people just harvest wild kelp or seaweed from the natural forests underwater, or are they always grown in structured, planned farms?
Well, there are canopy forming kelps like Macrocystis, giant kelp depicted behind me that grows all the way to the surface, and then it grows along the surface. And there you can use a lawnmower, call it a steamship kelp cutter. There's more than 100 years of history of that. In fact, the kelp harvest put San Diego on the map during World War I, where it was a strategic material to create smokeless gunpowder. So the kelp harvester would harvest 600 to 900 tons per day and just take the top meter of kelp, like mowing the lawn, and the kelp would grow again from 20 meters down. So that was a natural harvest. That said, the kelps that are present and prevalent today off Hudson Bay are subtidal kelps that are not as long as Macrocystis. And so they're subtidal, they're underwater. You either need to dive, or they have some machines that can harvest bladderwrack, but they're, somewhat, they'll also do a partial harvest. And so in shallow water, that can be done. And I think in answer to Lawrence's question, we have seen eelgrass on the East Coast diminish because the water becomes murkier. And when it's murkier, either due to eutrophication or runoff, and you get more microalgae, the visibility drops, and then the eelgrass starts going away. That's a key factor. So keeping the water clearer is key. And it turns out kelp forests are very good at reducing nutrients and making the water clearer. And so I think that's a big opportunity going forward. I do have some maps of Hudson Bay showing the projections of different kelps and how they are going to fare in the years ahead. And so with your permission, I'll share my screen and I'll share with you some of the maps, because I thought it was very interesting to hear that the west coast of Hudson Bay is sandy and the east coast is rockier. And of course, kelps do love rocks. We do encourage, if lines and platforms offshore, so you can take advantage of larger areas of Hudson Bay. But along the shoreline here, the green represents, there's 4 species of kelps here. Just in a nutshell, they represent different kinds of kelp. I can maybe share with you some of those that are here, which I'll do in a moment. But there are 4 different kinds of kelp, and the green shows where it is today. The blue in the middle shows where it will increase in 2050, and the red is where it would decrease in 2050. And with these simulations, where it would decrease in 2100. And so agarum is one species.
Wait a minute. I'm real difficult at learning these things. Now, the green area is actually underwater, and it's the shallow, rocky parts where the kelp is growing. Is that right? In this first.
That is correct. And there are 4 kinds of kelp. There's sieve kelp, which produces agar, and that grows today. All these species grow today in Hudson Bay. Bladderlocks is a second kind of kelp that is also useful for food, feed, and fertilizer products. Laminaria is also called, let's see. Well, I think it is called laminaria, and I don't know the common name offhand, but that grows all over from Alaska to the eastern areas, and in a lot of Arctic areas as well. And then Laminaria saccharina. Saccharina is a very popular kelp. It's called sugar kelp, and it's harvested in large quantities across the Pacific Ocean as well. So those are the 4 different species. And then the green shows where it is today. These are near shore areas where the kelps are growing today. And here's Alaria, which will have decreases in 2100, as shown on the right. Laminaria is growing a lot right now in the Hudson Bay region, but it's going to get wiped out by 2050 and totally wiped out by 2100, given the business as usual temperatures. The temperatures are going to get too warm, and the nutrient levels might become too low and might be stratified in the summer. Saccharina, interestingly, is an economic kelp today. It will see increases in 2050 along the western shores of Hudson Bay, but significant decreases by 2100, because again, the water will likely get too warm and the nutrient levels too low.
Now you got to decipher this. There's blue and there's red, and that's different from where it's green over here. What? Tell me again what these red and blue things mean.
Green is where it is today. Blue is where it's going to increase in the coming decades, and red is where it's going to decrease in the coming decades.
Oh, so you can predict it that well.
Yeah, so there's 227,000 square kilometers of saccharina right now, an extra 64,000 square kilometers in 2050, but only 17,000 by 2100. In contrast to this one, which is laminaria, and there you're going to see losses of 39,000 square kilometers and 212,000 square kilometers by 2100.
Okay. Well, now, which kind do we like?
Well, we
And
like just
why?
about all of them.
Or
I mean, in terms of what's economic today, Saccharina is economic today. We have people growing Saccharina from the eastern shores of the United States and North America to the Faroe Islands and as far west as Japan. So Saccharina is a ubiquitous kelp. There's a ready market for it. And given that it's going to increase at least through 2050, I'd say that's a really good one to consider starting with.
What do you think we will be doing with the stuff that we don't do now? There are a lot of things that I understand you can turn it into that would be good commodities. Well, first of all, I'd like to ask Lawrence, are the people living on those shores already using kelp for their diet or any other purposes? Or is this, would this strike them as crazy an idea as it probably does to most other people?
We haven't been using the kelp in that way as a food source on the western side, and our whole objective too is to be able to keep the earth as it is and not to mess around with the environment. So if we can help keep things as they are, that's the reason why we want to have a conservation project intact. But at the same time, we want to determine what is the best way in doing that. Our elders, they often talk about, the changes that are coming around, and for us to work vigorously in figuring out what is that might happen, because the air and the water are changing rapidly in this area. And as you can see from these diagrams, these are the changes that we're going to be seeing in the future. But there's already been changes that have happened, and those changes that's what they're talking about and are afraid may interrupt how well we live today, with the air being clean and especially with all that peatlands, the carbon that we have inland, which in this area that we have, it's the third largest carbon sink in the world. So making sure that we balance all of this. But in terms of just the kelp itself, we haven't been using it in very much on our side of the bay. But of course, into the north and to the eastern side, there's often stories about how it is being used by the people over there.
Yeah,
Well, what
Lawrence
else
is right.
Yeah. What do they use it for besides food?
It's food, and it's also keeping it intact in recognizing that it's part of the ecosystem, that other species of fish and so forth depend upon it, and we depend upon the fish. So we don't want to, harm the way the cycle of life goes. So being really careful if we're going to harvest it for any reason, making sure you only take what you need. That sort of concept, and that applies to everything that we have to take from the land, from the fish in the sea, and so forth.
Yeah, a couple examples of this. In 1620, the Pilgrims were stuck on the eastern shores of Massachusetts, and half of them starved to death in the winter of 1620. Sadly, they starved to death within meters of kelp that was growing in the sea, just very nearby. And in fact, two little girls got stranded in Alaska for 4 months, and they lived underneath this little dinghy that they had, and they ate kelp for 4 months, and they actually, sustained themselves with kelp. So it's amazing how different. And of course, in Asia, they've been using kelp for centuries. Seaweed soup has always helped mothers in childbirth. I mean, after childbirth, they would eat seaweed soup, and it's just one of the examples of so many benefits. I take a little seaweed every day, and look what's happened to me. And I can attest to both its digestive benefits and improved immune system. And so I do recommend adding seaweed to your as a supplement to your diet. And it's about sustaining nature. Lawrence said it beautifully, and that is, we want to build a permaculture. And what we mean by marine permaculture is helping to regenerate the kelp forests that exist and that will be growing, and then have a sustainable yield from those kelp forests, but also leave enough for nature, because we need to not only feed 8 billion people on this planet, but have enough primary productivity, enough food generation for the 8 million species who can't vote the 8 million species who are on the spaceship Earth with us. And we need to support those ecosystems because they are what is supporting our civilization.
Is this something that the people doing marine conservation have thought about so far? And if it were possible to retain ice in certain areas, would this, so far as you know, be a welcome contribution, or would you be apprehensive about it? Or other people living there can you think of, we have to think of all the downsides, everything that could go wrong. And how do you think people would regard this as an intervention to protect the ice?
Well, the first image that I got when you started talking about this was that all those folks that are waiting for the Northwest Passage to open up, all the transportation people that are trying to run their ships across the north part of Canada, I could see them jumping up and down and disagreeing with this because they want the ice to be removed so they can transport goods. Mm-hmm. And as far as what we've been talking about so far in our studies and speaking to the elders, they talk about the natural adaptation that we have to apply as the world begins to change. Again, it's always been in constant change over since time immemorial, and now we're seeing another change coming about. And I'm sure they would tell me if I were to talk about this in my language that I was being really foolish. And because we're so minute in terms of being a particular species, we think we're the ones that are causing this world to come to harm. But they say, no, it's a natural change that's going on. And to think that you can actually reverse the changes is even sillier. That's the first thing they would say to me if I were to talk about this. But I think by connecting the dots, what you guys were talking about, Brian and Peter, connecting those dots with what exists in the environment. So it was the kelp in this case, and the impact it has now with the earth as it is. I think if we were to approach it from a whole perspective and talk about it from that, then I can see people started to connect those dots and start to accept, oh yeah, there's possibilities that this could happen. I think people are afraid of the climate change itself and what it could lead to. And now we see permafrost melting in our territory. And of course, that releases these methane gases. And there was a video that was made by some people from California. I think it's called Fire on Ice. And it's quite interesting to see the melting of the permafrost and the gases coming to the surface of the ice and being able to light those gases with damp matches that somebody has down south here. And so I think people are open to looking at different things and to be able to hear them, because as we watch the world change, we're also in a constant debate about different things that are going on, and to think that maybe there's something we can do to help one way or the other. I think it's open. So for me to hear this, I'm glad to bring it to this topic, to this level of discussion, and for me to share it, with my audiences, because I do Zoom with the elders quite often, and I do radio shows as well, talking about the work that I do. So we're constantly talking to our people and hear it. So I'd like to take this topic, as one of the times when we talk to the elders and say, listen, this is what I heard from these folks. What do you think?
Wonderful. Well, actually, you've talked about the methane under the ice, and that is, very, very important. And in fact, Peter Wadhams is maybe the world's leading authority on methane under the Arctic ice. So you got the right guy to talk to.
I think there's an opportunity for us to work to regenerate healthy climate, and it won't be, revert. It won't be going back to exactly what we had before. But hopefully it's something that can sustain our populations and sustain civilization for decades to come. So it's a challenge and an opportunity that we need to do. And I think it's going to happen one step at a time. It needs to start small. But if we can build economic sustainability into what we're doing with agricultural products and be part of a regenerative habitat and biodiversity in Hudson Bay, James Bay, and larger areas, that it presents an opportunity. And I did want to mention on the ice topic, the Panama Canal is a very good model for this. You can actually build canals in the ice so that you can have the shipping year round, and you can also have the ice. And that's something that, if we're going to create thicker ice in places, we can also have the canals. And the economic model we use there is the Panama Canal, which gets $2 billion in revenue per year. And this has been explored for the Northwest Passage. And that is, you charge a fee to run through the canal, but you keep that canal open year round, and you thicken your ice on the sides of the canal. And now it becomes a bit more managed, but it also preserves the ice ecosystem. It enables the ship traffic, and it provides sustainable revenues for the communities in the surrounding territories. So just one thought that I wanted to share.
I love that idea. Yeah.
And I know in where I live here up in Northern Ontario, we're trying to partner up with all the different federal government components, the environment ministries, the fisheries and oceans and natural resources and so on. And the partnership is good because everybody has the same mindset, to work together. But in today's climate, with the provincial governments, they're not interested in the conservation that we're talking about, but more into economic development and opening up mines in this particular area just upriver from us called the Ring of Fire. And so we're afraid of the impact that will have on the whole ecosystem right into James Bay, 200 kilometers away in the Hudson Bay and so forth. So we're trying to partner up and try to work with them to develop some kind of mitigation plans to offset what could happen. And it's been a really tough sale. So
excuse me, I think we should explain, because I'm not too clear myself. I think that Ring of Fire is something that would destroy the wetlands, the peatlands on the south coast. Is that right? That is the real risk, that it's going to interrupt and release carbon from the peatlands?
Yeah, it'll do all of the above, but it's upriver. It's in the watershed area. So the water flows from west to east into Hudson Bay and James Bay, not just in the river systems, but that whole peatlands is, it's all wetlands. The water flows through there and through the creeks and everything. So so of course it will have an impact. And people are afraid of that, and because they depend on the food from the river systems, they depend on the animals and the caribous that migrate through that area. So it would be a big change for sure.
We need enormous care as well, because of the increasing prevalence of methane explosions, which have been happening greater and greater frequency, and it's in the movie that you mentioned, Fire and Ice. So I was in that movie.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow. There was some efforts to look at what happens if, in the winter, if you have simply a frozen lake, for instance, methane accumulates under the lake, and you can get an explosion, or you can set fire to it, or the whole thing might explode. But also, this is happening on land in coastal regions in the north of Canada, and in areas like Barrow in Alaska, where you get a kind of gigantic explosion, and a whole area that used to be permafrost has become the permafrost just been blown away. So there's a problem where enormous care is needed to avoid doing some really terrible damage to a place which is inhabited. And so we really, I think, need to worry a lot about methane and more than we have done in the past, because of its potential role in these phenomena.
Thank you, Brian.
Right. Yes, Lawrence mentioned the importance of eelgrass in James Bay and Hudson Bay, and how so many birds, migratory birds, depend on the eelgrass for healthy habitat. And this is exactly what gets threatened by the Ring of Fire. Here's an example showing a map of the Ontario Ring of Fire, and it depicts the regions that are at risk. And you can see rivers flowing to the east from the Ring of Fire. The murkiness of the waters in James and Hudson Bay are likely to be greatly affected by the mining activities that would be associated with the Ring of Fire. And thus, as soon as it gets a little murkier, you lose half or more of the eelgrass. And it's really a challenge to make the eelgrass waters clearer so that the eelgrass can thrive better. And I think in many ways, kelp forests and eelgrass together can grow together, because the kelp forest will make the waters clearer and the eelgrass will thrive in the clearer waters. And in contrast, the mining activities are going to make it much worse for both the eelgrass and the kelp forests. So that's a great example of how we need to really think through the environmental ramifications of what we're doing, and how can we sustainably manage those marine resources and address some of the challenges of these mining activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to know, what are some of the products that could be made from kelp? I believe that Brian says you have some sort of collapsible lab that you could ship off in and sort of unfold it, and you've got yourself a lab in which you can create all kinds of goodies and manufacture them and send them out. So I have this fantasy that where we set up stations to freeze the ice, keep the ice frozen in the winter and the summer, that if those stations are near places where kelp is already growing, then the communities would have an opportunity to have some jobs of both types, maintaining these operation, the station that's going to spray salt water, but also harvesting seaweed. But the practicalities of the thing are completely beyond me. I don't know how much of the seaweed you could take out without destroying or wrecking the ecosystem of the area. And once you get it, what can you make from it, and what would be some of the practical uses for it? I think that you've talked about biostimulants for plants, but I know that they make fertilizer from seaweed as well as food. And I believe there are other commodities that could be produced. And I have the notion that, if you had a little factory someplace near Churchill, that there are trains that go from Churchill, into Manitoba, and you could ship the stuff out, and that would be part of one of the other projects that we're looking at, is ways in which agriculture could benefit from soil amendments, and that this seaweed material could be part of the effort to make Canada's agriculture more sustainable without using chemical fertilizers, which have downsides to them. So I'm asking a whole bunch of questions of Brian, but in a word, could there be a real market for some new products that could be produced sustainably from kelp in Hudson Bay?
Yes, well, we found a dozen value chains for seaweeds and other kelp and other seaweeds, and they start with food and feed and fertilizer. We've touched on the food and the biostimulant fertilizers to some extent, but I do want to mention that seaweeds have been found to reduce the enteric methane emissions of ruminant livestock, which means cow burps and cattle and whatnot. And Canada and the US have a lot of cattle. Did you know that 40% of all emissions, of all greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, come from these ruminant livestock? And the methane factor is huge. And so being able to develop a cattle feed supplement and other kinds of products, even at 1% concentration, they can eliminate most of the enteric methane emissions of ruminant livestock. And in fact, this whole technology started in Canada. A farmer in Nova Scotia had a farm, and that farm had a road that went through it. And so half of the cows had 4 walls, and half the cows had 3 walls and a beach. And it turned out the cattle that he had on the beach were healthier, heavier, and some would say happier because they could eat all the kelp they wanted. So I think that was the beginning of what became an Australian technology that's being really developed now. And I think there's a dozen different seaweeds that have this effect or more, and some of which likely grow right near Hudson Bay. So it's a great opportunity. And at the Climate Foundation, we've been developing our marine permaculture transportable seaweed processor. And any community that can take a 20-foot shipping container on a truck and drop it can have one of these little bioprocessing facilities. And so it's one thing to harvest seaweed, and I want to say it's more like mowing the lawn and less about ripping it out of the ground. So with the right techniques, you're just mowing the lawn and the seaweed's going to grow back. And that's a very good perennial technique. And we're finding perennial crops are 10 times more valuable than the annuals, because the annuals, you're continually disrupting the soil and you're disrupting the worms and the ground and the soil and everything. By moving to perennial crops, we can plant once and harvest a dozen times. And whether we're on land or sea, perennials make so much sense. It's less work, it's higher production, and it preserves the ecosystem for our microbial friends on land and in the sea and the fish habitat. So with that said, it's one thing to mow the lawn and dry some kelp and ship it off, but it's another thing to process it into valuable food and feed and fertilizer products right there in Churchill or right there on the coastal communities. In fact, I flew in one day to Rankin Inlet way up north and stayed overnight, and it was a wonderful experience. And I love the Arctic communities around the coast of Hudson Bay. They're just beautiful. And so being able to get those containers there, unpack the little biorefinery and enable those communities to produce the high value food and feed and fertilizer products and provide them to neighboring agricultural communities. That's a huge value add that retains more of the economic dollar, if you will, within the community and enables these regenerative processes. And we call it a circular ecology from sea to land. And when you use biostimulants, it results in 20% less nitrate fertilizer, 20% less nitrous oxide emissions, and 20% less runoff back into the sea again. So there's the circular ecology from sea to land back to sea. And that becomes a circular economy from coastal communities to farmland and then back to the coastal community again. And that's what I believe will regenerate healthy communities across our nations. And I'm looking forward to being part of that regeneration.
That's exciting.
If I can put a word in for an area I know about that's very similar, the Channel Islands in between England and France, as for hundreds of years, been harvesting kelp from the beach, as they call it, vrike, and they just take a horse and cart and fork it up into the cart and feed that to cattle, and it's exactly the same effect. It's highly efficient in reducing flatulence and being nourishing. And of course, they were forced to do this during the war when there was no food around, and the cattle lived entirely off seaweed then. But it worked. They survived, and it's still an industry now. So there's long histories of this in different parts of the world that you learn from.
Right.
Just adding to what Peter's saying, I'm familiar with the Orkney Islands, where they have sheep that live on these small islands, and some of them eat 100% kelp to this day. And it's really interesting. Some of them eat a bit of grass in the summer, but they're eating seaweed year round, and they do remarkably well. So I think there are examples of livestock that are doing remarkably well. And of course, many seaweeds are generally recognized as safe by indigenous communities in Hawaii, for example, and across the Pacific Ocean. And these are generally recognized as safe in the United States, GRAS, which means you can offer these whole food products on the market. And that's, I think, a great opportunity to include seaweed in our diets, because, humanity evolved it through a bottleneck about 100,000 years ago. I believe it was in South Africa or some region near there. And it's pretty clear that we were coastal communities back then, because there is evidence for such a coastal diet of shellfish, small fish, seaweed, and maybe some vegetables and whatnot. And that's something that humanity seems to have evolved with. And so we're looking forward to getting us back to our marine roots, if you will, and ensuring that we've got healthy foods for sustaining our civilization for decades to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the idea of restoring things that have been lost, because clearly we know that the ice, there used to be ice, and things are going wrong because of the stuff we put in the atmosphere. And so if we can put it back to the way it should be, that nature had it, and using natural methods, and then this spraying of seawater into the atmosphere is something that nature does anyway, but we would just take the technology and apply it in a somewhat enlarged way. But then also the notion that all of these seaweeds that used to be great forests that are dying off in the warmer climates now, at least we want to replenish the world's forests of seaweed someplace, and if it's possible for them to benefit by growing in the Arctic and expanding, then let's look at that. If people would welcome that, but of course the people living there are the ones who have to decide whether this is something that would be useful and that they would desire, or it's going to mess up some other aspects of their livelihood. And for that, we need to talk to a lot of people who live in that area.
That's a great example, Meta, and that notion that you're spraying, seawater into the air to kind of regenerate some of that natural resource is important. And if you do that in the winter, you can actually build meters more sea ice on the Hudson Bay. And that's something that will provide the insulation for the summer. I liken the planet Earth to a glass of ice water. And, you've got a glass and it's full of ice, right? And you can heat it up for a long time, and the ice will melt and melt and melt, but the water temperature will stay at 0 degrees Celsius until that last ice cube melts, and then you go to hell in a handbasket. And you think of planet Earth as a glass of ice water, and you've got ice at the top of the planet. Well, what are we going to do when that last bit of sea ice melts and our planet? Really, we're going to get all the global warming we paid for then. And I think it behooves us to keep the ice in the glass of water and to keep the planet frozen, as Peter has so aptly articulated in previous years and decades. And that includes the Hudson Bay. And so it could be that spraying a little water in the wintertime can help us keep parts of the bay frozen, and can do it in a sustainable way that really is co-designed with the communities. But we have the technologies. The future is here today. It's just not broadly distributed yet. Anything we can do to help regenerating healthy ecosystems on the planet can go a long way towards getting us back to a healthy climate.
Yeah, I love the fact that, this is a natural phenomenon anyway. Nature does it. We just have to learn how to mimic nature. Lawrence, do you think that we should talk to some other people? I want to make sure that we've given this absolutely as much thought as we can before we start before we actually suggest to people that we might be able to do such a thing, because I'm not sure we can, but we're looking into it. And of course, it's very important to consult with and find out whether people would want such a thing. What do you think?
Well, the study that we're doing now, the feasibility study, there's a socioeconomic component to it, which we're about to launch. So in that sector, we're going to be identifying various economic opportunities, social responsibilities, and so on. So I can see this question of what you're talking about to be part of that study. So we can ask the people about kelp, because there's been a few communities in the past, say 10, 15 years, who have experimented in growing kelp with using solar energy and trying to grow it in a small little building, because electricity up here in northern Canada is pretty much non-existent. And the infrastructure is not there either. We don't have roads. We have winter roads, ice roads. So to look at it from a marketing perspective, it's a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging. But I think by asking the communities, and if they find this something feasible, something that they would include in their diet, then it makes sense to have it, grown in the community in some fashion. And as far as the spraying seawater into the air, I think to be able to explain that, maybe another movie, Peter, will have to come and be made up here to talk about that, and to you have to show people, that this actually works, it can work, and that there's all these different benefits to it. So yeah, I would like to have a continuation of this conversation as part of our feasibility study, because we need to look at everything, that is possible in James Bay and Hudson Bay area, and at the same time be able to solve some of these threats that we do have from the mining industries and so forth. And but I think by reaching out, our elders often say, you may go to great lengths to try and save these migratory birds, but don't forget you have to establish partners in California, in South America, Central America, because those birds fly over there. So you can't be the one to try and save them yourself in the north, because they come from somewhere. So I think in this case here, what we're looking at doing and what we need to do is expand our partnerships. So if I may get on some kind of a list that you have of people that can be contacted for further incredible ideas like this, I'd like to be that person.
We are so eager to talk to you and to other people living on those communities around Hudson Bay. I've reached out as much as I can, but I haven't been able to get many people. But I hope that in the future, every time we have a conversation about this issue, that we will include some people like you or some of your friends and other people working on the issues.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I can introduce you.
If Peter Wadhams is willing to appear in the movie, I think you should also appear and sing in Cree.
Hey, I'll do the soundtrack. Okay.
Perfect.
That's wonderful. And I think as we're building the social license, we can also begin the first plans. We actually, several years ago, designed a very small floating wind turbine that can spray water into the air in the winter and create more sea ice. And you could have a tiny little platform and just show, we have a funding gap of a few $100,000 to make the first one run. But there's no reason that can't be a small demonstration that people, community members and others can come and see and just say, okay, well, this is a big ice cube and it's lasting all summer. That's the kind of demos that we want to be able to create in the years ahead with public support at the Climate Foundation and working to regenerate healthy climate.
All right. Well, let me know what I can do to introduce you to our folks up here.
Perfect.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And those seaweed maps were done by I think Fisheries Canada. So
okay.
We need to connect with all the groups and help to make that a reality.
Well, this isn't a totally goofy idea after all, is it?
No, it actually made sense in the last hour.
Okay. Well, I'm glad. So let's do it again, and with other people, because we have a lot of people we have to check in with and find out more about. But I'm really grateful to all of you for your special expertise, which came together in a very productive way, I think. And I feel a lot smarter than I did an hour ago. So thank you very much. And time's up, and I'll be back in touch with you all. Okay.
Well, you
Thank
have my email. If I can have yours sent
Sure.
to my email, that would be great. And I'll keep in touch.
Certainly get in touch with you, and I'll show you the link to this too.
Okay.
Thank
Alrighty.
you. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Project Save the World produces these shows, and this is episode number 540. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. You can share information there too about 6 global issues, and you can comment on the ideas that other people have expressed in the comments column. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.